If you spend any time at all reading about conflict, you're more than likely going to have a view that roughly aligns with what you're seeing. Although I hope to demonstrate in this quick presentation that this is not all that needs to be considered in the current understanding of conflict. So without any hesitating, let's move forward and draw some lines between what we've got. All right, without getting too involved, we've got mutually assured destruction at the top. If you don't know about it, go do your research. It's a pretty big topic. Then below that, we're talking about the Clausewitzian threshold. For now, let's just consider that's when we deploy the military, the army specifically. And then, of course, below that, law and order and the various other lines that sort of relate to that. Like what's the difference between, say, when does an academic disagreement turn into something more? And that's kind of what these lines are meant to represent. Now we can also sort of break those lines down further, since we can assume a city of sorts at the top of MAD. And we got this nice little triangle. And then, because it's more likely that more widespread that they're war of words as opposed to, the deployment of the army. So you can kind of think of it that way. That represents the level of these disagreements going on just in general. Now it should be readily apparent when you look at this that you have to have much more order towards the top of this as opposed to at the bottom, because obviously you have a massive process towards the top of the pyramid and you have less process and more individuality, or however you want to phrase it, towards the bottom. All right, so now you can kind of notice the other trend here. You can split or break apart the triangle into two different spheres. You have the non-violent and the violent. Now, an important thing to sort of point out here, we'll get into later on, or that'll be very important later on, is this idea of an orthodoxy. That sometimes orthodoxy could be good, maybe sometimes it's not, but it can be this tool that leads people forward up the triangle. It'll bring order out of apparent disorder. So that's just something to pay attention to. All right, so now I just want to focus on the most organized domains of violent conflict. This, if you read the existing literature or what you would be taught around an army institution, would likely involve you concluding that these are just the three spheres that you need to worry about. However, this isn't really the case, as has been demonstrated lately. I mean, I've got my own experience in Iraq, but anybody who served in the army in the past 15 to 20 years would probably look at this and scratch their head and go, this just can't be it. And I'd agree with that, and we'll get into that. So here we are with our, let's call it the general breakdown of these three domains that you'd be expected to have some sort of run-in dealing with if you're in the uniformed service. And this should all be pretty obvious to most people. I think the only thing that is really, that might have some variability would be militia. But of course, this also raises a different point, right? The word can be somewhat meaningless, and it can mean kind of just anybody who's armed. And so I'd like to stick with what I've got defined here, and this is based on, again, the Army view that you'll probably get if you read about special forces from the OSS all the way into Vietnam. This is sort of the idea of the government-sponsored militia, whether it's in France, whether it's in Vietnam. That's kind of the militia I'm looking at here. And then you have this issue of the mafia, which you have less of that being written about, at least in army circles, but it's still definitely, there's plenty of literature out there that deals with this. Although there's less as far as how a deployed army, at least from the American perspective, would deal with this. Now, there's an important thing that so we got basically 3 units, right? But then there's this other book you read eventually, The Violent Gang by Louis Yablonsky, and there's an important chart in this book. So you take the 3 categories you'd be expected to know in the Army, and you notice they end up very nicely with the 3 categories that Yablonsky has. But then there's this thing, Yablonsky has this 4th category, this type 4, illegal, unsanctioned, irrational violence. And this is very relatable to anybody who served in the military lately, or anybody who's seen anything since 9/11. I mean, some of this stuff just seems senseless. Like, what is going on here? And so I'm not saying Yablonsky has all the answers, but I think this is an important thing to look at. So we're going to take this and now expand our original 3 M's, and we'll see where that takes us. All right, here we go. We've got the idea of expanding to what I call a pseudo militia, which I think are just pseudo anything. It's not really much of anything, which is kind of the point that Yablonsky writes about. He calls them near groups, which is a great explanation for why it's both so persistent and also seems to be so ubiquitous, and it's also the issue of domestic terrorism and all this other stuff. It's all, and why does it spread over the internet so easily? It's because it's this whole concept of a near group, which comes kind of a frightening concept when you start to think about the speed of communications in the modern world. But it's important to keep in mind that you can use this concept of pseudo militia to refer to the kamikaze in World War II. Like, it suddenly makes more sense. And you can also kind of look at this pattern. So, like, armies, why do I have an issue with conscripts so much? Well, it's because conscripts are not professionals, and they're really more of a militia inside of the regular army. And then you have the issue of, like, the kamikaze, which is now more of a pseudo militia, maybe organized through regular army channels or what have you. And sort of, we'll expand on this some more on the next slide. All right, here's my the broken pyramid design, and I think this is the way everything needs to be represented, with the broken pyramid, because this sort of shows you where you have a bit of guardrails, and then things kind of, when you transition between violent and non-violent, they kind of go everywhere and doesn't really make sense, and then you finally start to see more order emerge further up you go. And obviously, you're using the stuff at the top, right? You want your police force and your army to deal with this senselessness, right? You want to prevent it. And so this is sort of the interesting thing to me. Is like you have this where deadly move from a war of words, and then you end up in a senseless disagreement, and then somehow that senseless disagreement is turned into, some sort of something. It just doesn't make, I mean, that's why I can't, how do you talk about it? Because it doesn't make any sense to anybody. And so this is just something, an attempt to define them, right? And I've sort of noticed how on the internet you seem to get into there's this level of conversation that would never be tolerated in a traditional forum on the internet. But this is the view that I've sort of come around to, and this is something I think the military as a whole needs to start looking at, this whole senselessness, and that needs to dive more into, I guess, the law enforcement literature, and to see what tools need to be adapted to help deal with the problem. So this is why you should read law enforcement literature, because you'll run into these sorts of situations when you're in a larger conflict. and you need to have an idea about what's going on, because when you're actually over there dealing with it, one of these four zones is going to predominate before things get better. And so you need to know about all of these four domains in order to help you deal with that when you're on the ground as a soldier. So this is why, if you're a grunt, you should be reading modern law enforcement literature.